The historical context of the New Testament, Part 3. In Part 1, we focused on New Testament terms, where they came from. Part 2 was on New Testament people and how they were connected. This video is on terms that do not themselves appear in the text, but which were relevant in the first century. Flavius Josephus, the Jewish-Roman War, the Septuagint, the Essenes and the Dead Sea Scrolls, Hillel and Shammai, the Mishnah and the Talmud. Where did they come from, and why does it matter? We'll take another look at the Pharisees and Sadducees as well. Christians recognize this time period as the time that God chose to send his Son to the earth. Even non-Christians can appreciate how issues from this time have stayed with us, and that's true, even though the period of shared Roman-Jewish rule in Judea was short-lived, and that arrangement came to an end with a conflict described to us by the ancient historian Josephus. So I watched 3 videos on the Jewish-Roman War. The first was, for lack of a better term, pro-Roman. It focused on the tactics, the generals, on how Rome used her superior army to crush the revolt. The second video pointed out that Rome had provoked this revolt through its cruel occupation, its brutal taxes, and by robbing the temple. That video romanticized the Zealots as they made their last stand at Masada. But, according to a third video, those Zealots committed their own atrocities, mostly against other Jews. But that video was trying to be even-handed. It also criticized the Jewish leadership for siding with the Romans in an occupation that hurt so many of their countrymen. This, they argued, was a Jewish civil war. And it occurred to me then that I was learning less about the people who fought 2,000 years ago and more about the people who made these videos. Because it matters who's telling the story. So it matters that Josephus has a fascinating biography, a noble birth, a young commander who escapes death, switches to the Roman side, and completes a definitive history, the definitive history of the period. He was a close personal friend of a king, and we can trace his lineage back to a Maccabee. Speaking of the Maccabees, they must have been the inspiration behind the Zealots. Could a rebel army defeat an empire, seize the temple from a compromised priesthood, and usher in an era of Jewish independence? It had happened before. And this, you'll remember, is when we first bumped into the Romans. They came in looking for a fight, looking to take over. I'd argue that what happened in 70 A.D. was what Rome had in mind ever since Mark Antony supported Herod, when Pompey switched sides to support Antipater in that civil war, ever since the Senate made a treaty with Judas Maccabeus, ever since the Roman ambassador Gaius Popilius gave that ultimatum to Antiochus IV. Rome had a destiny and a plan. The internal Jewish conflict, by the way, did not rise by accident. Rome bought off one class and then brutalized the other. Divide and conquer. So does that mean that the Sadducees were traitors for working with the Romans? Maybe, but what other choice did they have? Trace this line of high priests back and you'll see them working with the Greeks, the Seleucids, the Ptolemies, the Antigonids, working with the Persians, even working with some bad kings in Judah. Or you could trace that line back further, before the temple, all the way back to Aaron. And it would be great if all the kings were good and holy like Hezekiah and Josiah, but that has never been the case and never will be. God instituted the Levitical priesthood specifically because the world is corrupt. Our task is to cleanse and heal a corrupt world. That's what they'd say. I repeat, we need the temple and the priesthood specifically because the world is bad. All we ask, the Sadducees speaking here, all we ask is for enough space to perform the ritual to get it right. That's what God demands of us, and we'll trust him to work out the rest of the details because we know who we are. We know where we come from. We know what we need to do. So, yes, you might find us rubbing shoulders with foreign princes and foreign ideas, but why not? Consider again this controversy from part 1. 3 men have their eyes on the temple and the office of high priest. One is a direct descendant of Zadok and well respected. Another descendant of Zadok is installed with the backing of the king, a king who then shifts his support to a third priest, a Benjaminite. The next candidate is a Levite, although not from Zadok's line. He has both zeal for the law and troops under his command. So here's the question: whose claim is legitimate? Or are we forced to wait to see who is able to hold the office? Does it just all come down to force? Onias IV did not think so. Viewing himself as the rightful heir to his father's office, but realizing that he was not going to get that office in Jerusalem, Onias IV traveled to Egypt and founded a new temple there. Also in Egypt, a bit to the north of that new temple, is a community in Alexandria that is right now finishing up a translation of the Bible from the Hebrew into the Greek, the Septuagint. This is the Bible that the New Testament writers read and quoted from, and I mention it for several reasons. Number one, to point out that the apostles would be speaking Aramaic thanks to Nebuchadnezzar and reading Greek thanks to Alexander the Great. History matters. Number two, to point out that the Holy Family's flight away from Jerusalem did not mean a flight away from the Jewish community. Instead, it was a moving from one community to another. The diaspora did not start in 70 AD. Number three, because one response to corruption is to withdraw and to start over. And that's what the Essenes did, choosing to live in an isolated community like the one at Qumran, the one responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls. So where do they fit in our outline? It's uncertain, but one possibility takes us back to Judas Maccabeus, who is still battling against the Greeks. He is ultimately defeated, and the Greeks retake Jerusalem and install, or possibly reinstall, a Hellenizing high priest. Jonathan succeeds his brother as military leader. Alcimus takes down a wall in the temple, a wall that separates Jews and Gentiles. He is struck with an illness, paralyzed, and dies. His replacement is unknown, but one guess is that this priest is the teacher of righteousness mentioned in the Qumran documents. His reign in Jerusalem, though, is short, and that's thanks to another Greek king, Alexander. Problem is, though, he's not king yet, but he will soon get the throne thanks in part to a military alliance with Jonathan. And what's Jonathan going to get out of the deal? He'll be recognized as high priest. So, I ask you again, who is the legitimate high priest? The one with the most zeal, or the one with the political connections? And again, according to this theory, this is when the teacher of righteousness moved out to the Dead Sea at the same time that Onias IV fled to Egypt. In any case, the offices of king and high priest will be combined throughout the Hasmonean dynasty. The descendants of Zadok, the Sadducees, we've seen they already have reasons to oppose these descendants of the Maccabees, but they also have reasons to work with them. Temple sacrifices are obviously important, but there are other aspects to living a life pleasing to God. That's where the Pharisees come in, a caste of teachers. In part 1, I suggested that the difference between Pharisees and Sadducees could be traced back to Hellenization. And I cringe a little bit at that statement now, but I was trying to frame this controversy in terms of something ongoing, not something that was settled in the first century. And you might get that idea if you connect the worldly Sadducees to the temple that was destroyed and the Pharisees to the synagogue which survived. True in a way, I guess, but in the New Testament we remember that Jesus met Pharisees in the temple and Paul met Greeks in the synagogue. Speaking of ongoing issues, consider these two slides. One calls the Pharisees liberal. The other uses that same term for the Sadducees. Neither mean it as a compliment. The Pharisees are being criticized for adding to Scripture and thereby nullifying the commandments of God. The Sadducees are criticized for their elitism, for getting rich off the temple while ignoring the needy, for not knowing the Scriptures, that He is a God of the living. And that takes us back to the faith of the Zealots and the Jewish-Roman War. The Zealots have some early success, especially up north. The outcome of the conflict may seem obvious to us in hindsight, but it was not at the time. Rome sends in reinforcements and Vespasian, and then the emperor commits suicide, and there is a scramble for power in the capital. Vespasian leaves for Rome. Is this the same pattern as the Seleucids and the Maccabees? Well, in a way it is, but Vespasian leaves another general who is both competent and loyal, his son Titus. The future emperor lays siege to Jerusalem. The population is trapped and desperate. Fighting breaks out inside the city and the stockpiled food goes up in flame. After the conflict, the population that survives is dispersed throughout the empire. Agrippa and his wife sided with the Romans and fled to Rome, and they survive. Several high priests, as we already mentioned, were killed for collaborating with Rome. The last high priest was a zealot leader chosen by Lot. He died when the city fell in 70 A.D. It was an office that had been occupied in the temple for 1,000 years. The last Nasi was killed by the zealots, a reminder that the Pharisees and the Sadducees had many things in common. But the Nasi was not the only leader of the Sanhedrin. We mentioned another office in part 2, specifically Caiaphas. For this video, let us highlight the houses of Hillel and Shammai, one more inclusive and the other stricter, both influential. And even if one side outvoted the other in the Sanhedrin, both the opinions were often recorded, and sometimes the losing side prevailed in the long debate. And wait a minute. Debate in an assembly? Debate that runs the risk of decaying into sophistry but also has the potential to drill down to deeper truths? This sounds a bit Greek to me, so maybe the division between the Sadducees and the Pharisees does go back to Hellenization after all, to approaches to it. The Sadducees holding materialistic Greek ideas next to Jewish liturgical methods, and the Pharisees exploring Jewish ideas through a Greek lens of dialogue, a method. Records of this dialogue survive because this man was smuggled out of the doomed city and allowed by Rome to continue studying, teaching, and meeting in a city called Jamnia. And this reconstituted Sanhedrin or reconstituted Great Assembly lasts for centuries through other revolts. Its members do not rebuild the temple, but they do compile the Mishnah, and then as other scholars add more commentary to the Mishnah, they complete the Talmud. This assembly also finalizes the Hebrew canon, and it should be called the Jewish canon, not the Hebrew canon, because some texts written in Hebrew, like 1st Maccabees, are excluded. And in the following centuries, other scholarly communities in the East will add vowel marks and give the Hebrew Bible an authoritative form, the Masoretic text. Further to the west, the Jewish community of the diaspora will outlive another empire. Constantine converts and moves the capital of the empire to Constantinople. The empire splits in two. The assembly is dissolved, and another Persian empire takes over Judea. As a prophet from Mecca begins his ministry, the Crusades will happen 400 years in the future, and Constantinople will fall 400 years after that. But we return back to the 1st century and to Titus, who becomes emperor after his father. He builds an arch to celebrate his victory over Jerusalem. He builds the Colosseum to spend the gold that was looted from the city, and he has an affair with the last Jewish queen, damaging his public image. And then he dies of natural causes, giving an opportunity to his younger brother. Domitian squabbles with the Senate and violently persecutes both Jews and Christians. He banishes the last surviving apostle to the island of Patmos. John is caught up in a vision and writes his Apocalypse, the book of Revelation. It is a vision of the end of the world. But in a sense, the world has already ended in 70 A.D. as the temple, a microcosmos, was leveled. The Christians in Jerusalem, remembering their Savior's words, fled the city. They are scattered throughout the empire. A new multinational Catholic people, a new priesthood can be traced back to the apostles, a new lineage in new cities. Ceremonies performed and words spoken by the Master become rituals and texts, doctrines and traditions. Some believers gather in councils to define dogmas. Others live as hermits or join communities as monks and nuns. Missionaries spread the faith. Scholars copy manuscripts and later found universities. The effort to reconcile Athens with Jerusalem continues. And because not all kings are saints, the church finds a way to make room for herself in each century alongside each empire, despite her own internal divisions, even her own civil wars. To be in the world but not of the world, because none of those questions from the 1st century have ever really gone away. Those questions of texts, those questions of authority, those questions of continuity.